Thank you so much for having us. And I can't begin to tell you how thrilled I am to be with these brilliant women tonight. And they have a presentation for us before we dive into this conversation. But I want to say that, your first book together changed lives, and this one is too. And I'm just really excited to hear more because I am definitely mad. And looking forward to getting mad together in righteous ways this evening and putting it into action this weekend when the Women's March is happening on a Saturday.
Right.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much for having us. Still Mad is a companion to The Mad Woman in the Attic, which we wrote more than 40 years ago, and which deals with women writers in the 19th century. Still Mad simply says that 20th and 21st century women, like their predecessors, are still angry. We began this book when various disabilities made it impossible for us to travel to the 2016 Women's March in Washington, D.C. It reminded us of the 1970s Women's March, though the presiding spirit of each event could not have been more different. In 1970, many feminists believed that the social order was changing and equality was within sight. However, in 2016, most protesters were shocked that a competent and seasoned female candidate had been defeated by a corrupt huckster. What had happened?
Hillary Clinton was part of the generation that came of age in the 70s. And the contradictions in her life reflect the tensions and ironies that many participants in the second wave of feminism experienced. We were told to reach for the stars, but also to stand by our man. We were encouraged to read Socrates and Plato, but became connoisseurs of sweater sets and pleated skirts. These paradoxes shaped the lives and words of the literary women who gave the second wave its words. Sylvia Plath, for example, on your left, wanted to become a triple threat woman, to succeed as a wife, a mother, and a poet. The life she led in the 50s and the poetry she produced in the early 60s, for example, Daddy, Lady Lazarus, the Bee Sequence, illuminate the terrible contradictions that destroyed her, even as they made her an icon, as does her posthumously published novel, The Bell Jar. Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich became very good friends in the 70s, but in the 50s, they too struggled with the tension between their literary ambitions and their efforts to conform to restrictive views of women's place in the home with husbands and children.
Lorraine Hansberry was one of the few women in the 50s steeped in feminist intellectual history. She studied Mary Wollstonecraft, Sojourner Truth, and Simone de Beauvoir. In her prize-winning play, A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry suggests that the domestic ideology of the 50s weakens women, and that in any case, this ideology rarely shaped the destinies of most Black women. Like Hansberry, the poet Gwendolyn Brooks depicted working-class women, some alienated from the white women who hired them. All these women composed works about the toxicity of enforced domesticity before 1963, when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which is not to take away from her achievement, but to contextualize it. Throughout the 60s, liberal women were organizing in NOW, while Nina Simone was extending the insights of the civil rights and Black Power movement to confront the unique difficulties of Black women. Her evocative 1964 song, For Women, can be read as a feminist polemic, a counterpart to her friend James Baldwin's book, Nobody Knows My Name.
In the 60s, Gloria Steinem wrote about contraception and Playboy bunnies. Her evolution illuminates the link between the sexual revolution and the emergence in the 70s of Ms. Magazine. You see an updated version here of one of its early covers. Later in the 60s, Susan Sontag was one of many women writers, Mary McCarthy, Grace Paley, Denise Levertov, who were active in protests against the Vietnam War. war resistance paved the way for the eruption of feminist protests in the momentous year 1968, when the first witch actions sparked headlines. In the 1970s, Sontag would go on to write 3 philosophical treatises on feminism, which went largely unread at the time.
In 1970, when Kate Millett published her groundbreaking Sexual Politics and Toni Morrison published her haunting novel, The Bluest Eye, feminism was making headlines. Millett stands for other theorists in the 70s, Shulamith Firestone, Robin Morgan, just as Morrison stands for other novelists in the 70s who focused on the destructive socialization foisted on girls. Erica Jong, Rita Mae Brown, Marilyn French.
James Tiptree, Joanna Russ, Ursula Le Guin. These are the 3 most significant authors of speculative fiction in the 70s. Like Adrienne Rich, the poet laureate of the second wave, all 3 imagine the awakening of feminist consciousness in dystopias and utopias. Their heroines discover the horror of patriarchy's power over women, or they seek to envision a good and no longer masculinist world of gender equality. In the 70s, too, Alice Walker and Maxine Hong Kingston linked women's subordination to racial, ethnic, linguistic, geographic, and religious factors. In this sense, they began to lay the groundwork for the ideas about identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality that would arise in the 80s. In 1979, Judy Chicago's dinner party assembled plates representing women artists around a large triangular table to celebrate women's creative achievements, though her mostly white cast of characters and the vaginal images on her plates would soon come under attack as racist or essentialist.
During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the work of Andrea Dworkin, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Toni Morrison elaborated upon identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality, as did Adrienne Rich. Dworkin in her battle against pornography, Anzaldúa in the concept of mestiza consciousness, Morrison in her prize-winning novel, Beloved, as well as her critical publications on race and gender, and Rich in essays and poems about being part Jewish, or, as she put it, split at the root. By the 90s, feminist academics like Eve Sedgwick and Judith Butler were responding to the homophobia fueled by the AIDS epidemic to enlist feminists in defending the rights of gay men. In the process, they generated queer theory, as well as much of the language we now use about non-binary, genderqueer, or transgender people.
Such poets as Anne Carson also sought to dismantle outworn gender binaries, as did postmodern entertainers, think of Madonna, and transsexual authors, for instance, Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein. But by the end of the 90s, feminists, radical, liberal, straight, gay, Black, Chicana, post-colonialist, post-structuralist, postmodernist, transsexual, third wave were splintered in an American culture that persistently lumped them all together and denounced them as, in the infamous words of Rush Limbaugh, feminazis. Not pictured here are the women who joined in this backlash against feminism.
So it is a relief to land in the 21st century with Alison Bechdel and Eve Ensler, who now calls herself V. In her graphic novels, Fun Home and Are You My Mother, Bechdel explored the impact of the second wave on parents born before it and daughters born after it. In multiple performances of her celebrated play, The Vagina Monologues, as in her subsequent global campaign, 1 Million Rising, Ensler, or V, sought to raise consciousness about ongoing violence against women. In 2008, Susan Stryker brought out her transgender history, and in 2016, Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts won the National Critics Circle Award. Both reflect the rise of transgender studies and the prominence of trans as well as non-binary advocates within feminism.
At the same time, feminist writers were aligning themselves with activists against ongoing racial injustice and ongoing environmental threats to the planet. Claudia Rankine's Citizens makes Black Lives Matter, while N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy describes the suffering inflicted by cataclysmic climate changes after the acceleration of global warming. As the Me Too movement evolved, Patricia Lockwood's memoir, Priest Daddy, and Rebecca Solnit's essays protested what Solnit called mansplaining in a society that continued to be ruled by patriarchs, often vicious in their subjugation of women.
Beyonce is probably the most famous example of the growing impact of feminism. Could we go to the next slide? There she is. Beyonce is probably the most famous example of the growing impact of feminism on American popular culture today, especially in her movie Homecoming, which repeatedly quotes Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, and other pioneers of Black feminism. Also a celebrity, Margaret Atwood, whose Handmaid's Tale was reinvented as a TV series at the start of the Trump administration, composed its hopeful sequel, The Testaments, to suggest that sisterhood is still powerful enough to bring about a better world. The feminist imagination continues to rely on dystopian and utopian fantasies. While the second wave was going through a revival in the 21st century, such political figures as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stacey Abrams, who is herself a novelist, were mobilizing the disenfranchised to secure their rights under the law.
And they were doing this while Nancy Pelosi was the most powerful woman in American politics, second in line of succession to the presidency. Like many of her colleagues, Pelosi wore a white suit when she tore up Trump's State of the Union speech before television cameras to honor the suffragists who fueled her anger and paved the path to rebellion.
After the shocking defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016, it was especially wonderful to celebrate the triumph of Vice President Kamala Harris in 2020, the first woman to rise to such prominence, as well as First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, the first First Lady to continue pursuing a professional career out of the White House. Of course, there was backlash against them all, most shockingly on January 6th, when toxic masculinity and proto-fascism raged through Washington, D.C.
Did the glass ceilings feminists had shattered issue in the broken windows of the Capitol? Will mad women always spawn mad men? We managed to evade such a gloomy conclusion when 22-year-old African-American Amanda Gorman recited a poem on the inaugural stage in which she said, among other stirring words, "We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation."
All the women of the feminist movement who met, marched, struggled, and brought a new order into being helped teach her those words. And now we would echo them. So even though we've said absolutely nothing questionable at all, we would like to start opening things up now to questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was riveting to see what has happened over a relatively short period of time in terms of human history, but also a considerable amount of time. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, you explore in the book this idea that the second wave is still happening. And I'd love to hear you explore that a bit from the perspective of someone who was raised by a Black second waver who considered herself as a member of Women's Lib, but also Black power movements. Mm-hmm. Then I grew up during a time of the emergence of the third wave and read many of the books of people who were coining the third wave as a terminology, but then was young enough on the younger side of the third wave to feel as if we were an emergent wave of some sort that were using social media and different tools, but focused in on the activism in a way that was really close to our second wave mothers, and kind of wondering where to anchor ourselves, but also having that passion for pop culture that third wave is so known for. So I'm curious about what you're thinking about the waves and how best we should talk about them, because I'm still having an identity crisis over how we should talk about the waves. And your book gave me so much food for thought.
Well, the first thing I want to say is when we talk about the first wave, we're talking about a long span of time between Seneca Falls in mid-century and the granting of the vote in 1920. That's a long period of time. And I think that was our paradigm for the second wave, which we do see as having stages. I was very thrilled by the emergence of the third wave manifestos, mostly in the 90s, and wouldn't you say at the sort of around the 90s, I would put it. And I'm not trying, I don't think either one of us is trying to discredit the fact that a new forms of feminism are always emerging, and this one was called Third Wave. And I think you're perfectly right to attribute a fascination with pop culture to part of it, and to the new technologies as well.
Right.
That said, I would add that I think Sandra and I both feel that the women who had the problems that we talked about in the 50s, who couldn't be, having a husband, having a child, and having an ambition and having a career, I think we both feel very passionately that that is still a problem for young women today. Just as the issue of abortion being illegal in 1950, we know now that abortion is illegal in Texas. At least right now it is, and all those things that were gained in the 70s are threatened again. So to that extent, I think that's why we talk about one wave.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think what Susan is saying is that while we have new possibilities, clearly we have new possibilities, we do have the same problems. I remember when I was teaching at Princeton, where everyone felt very entitled and lucky for obvious reasons. And they would just say, we've come a long way, Professor. We don't have those problems that you used to have. And I would say, come back to my office 10 years from now or 15 years from now, when you're trying to manage a family and a career, and tell me that you don't have those problems, those conflicts remain.
Yeah, will add just that the pandemic really outlined the asymmetry of women and men in the workforce in terms of its effect. I mean, so many women had to either curtail or give up their jobs. So it's still an enormous problem.
Yeah, even now, what they're trying to cut out of the bill that Biden wants to pass is preschool, right? I mean, it's particularly they're aiming almost at women when they say, well, we don't think that's necessary. We think new roads and bridges are necessary, but we don't think preschool is necessary for anyone.
I'm so glad that you're speaking to that, because I think what I love too about how you were connecting things across culture, but also with a strong root in an economic analysis was really important. One of the conversations I've really enjoyed, one of my passions in feminist work that I feel like I've been able to live into is intergenerational partnership. And so I've been able to work with people, much younger than myself, in their teens and tweens, and people who are in their 90s who've seen a lot and have taught me a lot of things. And one of the conversations I had is I had one of my feminist mentors ask me if there was anything I disagreed with her on. And I said, while I do believe, and this was before what has happened in Texas happened, so, I might have framed it differently. While I do believe that reproductive justice is one of my core issues when I think about why I get up in the morning and fight every day, my student debt is the reason why I don't have children. It has driven almost every decision in my life over the past 20 years, because I graduated into a recession. I was a senior during 9/11, and I'm a part of a generation that was inherited a bad economic hand. And that, in addition to misogyny, reproductive injustice, that was the Bush administration when I was also in college, has shaped this viewpoint where I think student loans and economic justice are reproductive health issues and reproductive rights issues. And I would like to see that be more platformed in our movements. And so I was really enjoying that you had voices like AOC's and Stacey Abrams included in the book, because Stacey Abrams was one of the first elected officials I'd ever heard admit that she had student debt, and that was why she should represent us, because she knows. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that around the decisions you made around how to weave in all of the aspects of our lives and policy experiences from culture to economics, because that really spoke to me and added to some of what I think is too often missing from our discourse.
Well, I think that's what distinguishes this book from The Mad Woman in the Attic, actually. The Mad Woman in the Attic consists of very detailed readings of novels. Whereas this is a book that goes from 1950 to 2020. And what we're trying to do is to use your own language, weave together the economic, social, and political history with what seems like an extraordinary phenomenon from our point of view, that this is one of the few social movements that was really served mightily by literary women. Poets, novelists, dramatists, memoirists created the language and the tactics for the second wave, and they reinvented them in its various stages.
Right. And I think we really wanted to contextualize all those texts with the history that was unfolding around them, and that was in point of fact shaping them. And there's like a really deep way in which they were shaped.
Well, so for example, one of the strands in the book, which we're interested in, is a very odd lineage of white women who are anti-feminist, going from Helena Deutsch and, all the way through to Ann Coulter, let's say,
Phyllis Schlafly.
Phyllis Schlafly in the center, in the very center.
Very center.
Right at the center, Phyllis Schlafly. So we wanted those political voices woven in because we wanted to understand the relationship between feminist discourse and the kind of reactions it was creating, not only in conservatives, evangelicals, Republicans, anti-abortionists, but also among white women. What does this mean? It's something we haven't fully, we trace it, but we leave it as a question what this means.
Yeah, I think it is a question.
I mean, a majority of white women voted for Trump.
So I'm so glad you brought this up, because you knew I was going to come to this party and ask you a little bit about that, because there's anger, right? There's anger there, and it's an anger embedded in white supremacy that motivates those women who want to protect their privilege. But I did enjoy your treatment of the problem of Phyllis Schlafly, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit about it, because one of the things that I think haunts me to this day is that I often meet feminist young people who believe in equality and all the things we do, who don't realize that they're not protected by the Constitution because we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. And she was the person who was, held responsible in the public square because of patriarchy for that. And there were men who actually passed those laws as well. But I wanted to hear from you a bit about what you think about that as well. Around, I think a book like yours is so important for education, because there's so much misinformation or a lack of information about how dire the situation really is. And I'm just thinking back to when I was teaching undergrads at John Jay, and I asked everyone in the class, who thinks you're protected by the Constitution? And everyone raised their hand almost. And how I had a couple of people say I was lying when I said the Equal Rights Amendment would make it so that you, because of your gender, would have constitutional equality, but you don't have that. And how many people who had said they didn't consider themselves feminists came out of the class changing their minds about it when they found out that fact. So I was wondering a bit about that, about how we get more education out about how dire this is, but also how dire attitudes and amplification of the Schlafly, the next generation of Schlaflys can be for us in our cause.
You could say that there's almost a direct line in a curious way. What you're saying is making me think this, from Schlafly to Trump. I mean, Trump's misogyny and Trump's sort of the women who vote for Trump. I heard an interview with some woman in Montana or something who said, "Oh, he makes me feel safe." So he was like a big bullying daddy who would make these these sort of delicate white housewives feel safe. And they thought little to nothing about his ideas, except for his misogyny and his racism and his ghastly ideas about immigration. All of that made them feel safe.
Let me punctuate that by telling you, if you don't know, that at Phyllis Schlafly's funeral, Trump was one of the main speakers.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, he really admired her. So Sandra's idea that there is a lineage there is well to the point.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Wow. I mean, I'm so glad we brought it up because it's something I think about quite a bit. And I want, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the ERA is I want people to also see that it's always been an intraracial, intergenerational movement, that we all have a piece in it. And I feel like I'm going to be giving your book to a lot of people who need to be educated in this subject, but also who need, what you do too is you really connect the facts in a compelling way to be able to have the stories for us to share with other people in the spirit of consciousness raising, which you talk about, and you talk about your classes as being consciousness raising, but this book is a consciousness raising material. So I was wondering about that too. You know, we're in a period of isolation right now. We're socially distant. In another time, we would have maybe done this event together in person in a room where I could, you know, give you a hug afterward if you consented to it. And
Which we would.
I would love it and receive it so warmly. And I was curious about that, around how, you know, what does consciousness raising look like for us now? And I believe books are a strong part of that, but I want to hear from you how we can keep doing that for each other, because one of the things I have taken so much to heart from second wavers, as I, you know, understood the second wave before reading your book, was this idea that, oh, when we have these connections through consciousness, that is how we grow. That is how we as a collective strengthen ourselves. And I'm wondering, what are some ways that we can take what we're learning from books like yours out into the world and help elevate others' thinking and change things?
Well, I think one thing to be said about it strikes me as something you have yourself said about the importance of stories. You talk quite a bit about the importance of stories. And one of the things we wanted to do in this book was not simply recount what's in sexual politics, but talk a little bit about the story of Kate Millett's life. Mm-hmm. Not merely analyze A Raisin in the Sun or Lorraine Hansberry's views on Simone de Beauvoir and a beautiful essay she wrote, but to actually talk a little bit about Lorraine Hansberry's life, because we thought that by combining the biographies with the text, that would be a way for us, the way women did in the 70s, to learn not just about the ideas, but about how the authors were living out their ideas, and how much tension there was, how much contradiction and paradox there was in those lives and their relationship to the work.
Yeah, I think we were interested in kind of profiles in courage, to use a long ago term, profiles in courage, along with the poetics that such profiles produced, right? And the politics of the poetics. I don't mean to be unduly alliterative, but I think that those were all things that were extremely interesting to us. And we were trained as critics to really do textual analysis, but we found that what we wanted to do was also a kind of biographical analysis. It was got very important to us in the course of writing this book.
And I love the connections you've made and the dots you connected. And some of them were ones that wouldn't have naturally occurred to me, but then when you laid them out with the vision of a critic, it helped me to connect other dots. And so I'm just sharing that to everyone who's going to buy and read this book after this conversation tonight, that there were some ties that you made that have really shifted also how I think about whose predecessor and whose visions are informing the directions we're going. I was thinking about a debate that I had with someone about Zora Neale Hurston and whether I could call her a Black feminist, because their argument, and this was a white male historian, is that she was more of what we would call a libertarian now in terms of many of her personal views. And I would not debate that, but I also think that so many of the ways in which she was living her life and the way she spoke truth to power and was misogynistically affected would allow me to feel that I'm more than happy, confident, and sure that I claim her as a Black feminist icon, and don't think that there's any conflict in that. And so I love how you connected her and also Claudia Rankine.
Well, I love the way Claudia Rankine, names her as a predecessor. And actually, her book has those words, as it were, engraved throughout it.
And I love that you're shining that light on it.
Yeah, and even before Claudia Rankine, there's also Alice Walker. I mean, if it weren't for Alice Walker in the night, and this is again in the 70s, this is part of the excitement of that period. I mean, there was such a thrill about this. It was as if there was something spiritual going on. Sandra and I keep on hearing the words awakening and change and anything is possible. These are the words that you were hearing in the 70s. But Alice Walker, really nobody knew about. So she was not in print when Sandra and I were teaching. Zora Neale Hurston was not in print. You could not.
Alice Walker published that essay in Ms.
In Ms.
So, right. I mean, and Gloria Steinem had sort of singled out Alice Walker to work on Ms. And, that gave Zora Neale Hurston suddenly an enormous audience.
Yeah.
Of course, there were so many of us who were passionately reading Ms. at that time.
Mm-hmm. You see the same intergenerational relationships with Alison Bechtel when she looks back at Virginia Woolf, for example. I mean, the second book, the second graphic novel, is full of analyses of To the Lighthouse, because she was really dependent upon the idea that Woolf was the first to write about how the boys get educated, the sons get educated, but the women don't. That the boys are favored and are inheritors, but the girls are not. And Bechtel uses that for her own reasons to get mad.
I love that too. And I was just thinking, you made me smile because I was thinking about how I feel really lucky that I came up at a time where I look at every movie through the lens of the Bechdel test, because that having that consciousness, right, and having access to that changes how I see media, and I think that's very exciting.
Is it two women who are talking together and not about a man?
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And I love it because then you can apply it to so many other facets of our intersectional identities too, and it's so brilliant. But I also wanted to talk with you about one other thing that I get mad about. And that's that I find that there's so much conversation about infighting, or, I'm going to use cat fighting to be incendiary because it's the sexist thing that we hear all the time. And there's always a clamoring to kind of highlight that when feminists disagree on anything, like regular humans do. And not enough talk about solidarity. And that is also something that happens a lot in our communities. And so I love that you talk about tension and you're drawing connections and bridges in the book, because I think too often the focus is so much on the tension, or so much on the places where we have different theories of change, and not on where we're moving forward with a clear vision and connection. Or maybe sometimes the tensions are good because they can be productive.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I wanted to hear what you think about that, and you lay that out in the book, but a little bit more about kind of, what do you think about what it means for us not to always get along, not to always see things the same way?
In the 70s, it was called trashing. And there was a lot of language about women trashing each other and bickering. Fights between Friedan and Steinem, arguments between Muriel Rukeyser and Alice Walker. And then in the 80s and 90s, I think we see it through the lens of intersectionality, where we see white women disagreeing with Black women. And as you just said, those things can be extremely creative, those sorts of tensions, painful as though they are. So that in our more recent history, for example, the Me Too movement has been analyzed as about white women victims, Well, today in the news, there's an indication that finally Black women who are the victims of abuse are being sponsored by the Me Too movement. So I think that out of these disagreements does grow a kind of tension, but also a kind of creative elasticity of inclusiveness.
I would like to interject, however, that there's a curious way in which this sense of competitiveness among women goes back to the fact that, as Sylvia Plath noted in her journals, there's really only room for one great woman poet. If she wants to be the poetess of America, as she did, then Adrienne Cecile Rich cannot be the poetess of America. There can be only one, because women were tokenized, in a sense.
That's right.
Now, where there's only room for one, there's a lot of reason for everybody to get mad at everybody else and to have a lot of anxiety. I mean, sisterhood may be powerful, but it's also anxiety inducing. They could have been, I mean, they met and they admired each other, Rich and Plath, but there really could only be one who would end up on top.
Yeah.
That's so powerful too, because it's, you know, a function of both patriarchy and white supremacy, because we see that when women of color are pit against each other in sort of exceptionalist models as well. You know, as we dismantle that and see, you know, I think about Fannie Lou Hamer, none of us are free unless we all are, right? That every time we dismantle that and push away from that competitiveness, like you said, it makes us more free and moves us closer to the goals of liberation. So I want to so we have some good questions here. So I just want to put one last question for me before we open up the circle. Even though we're in a square, we're really in a circle because this is a feminist discussion. And the last question for me is a question about the conversation about anger in general. And I was super excited to get to weigh in Science Journal, a feminist journal, about some books on anger a couple of years ago. Soraya Chemaly's book on anger, Rebecca Traister's, and Brittany Hooper's. And they both had books come out around the same time. And what I found annoying at that time, being a fan girl of all of those writers and deeply respecting them, was that there was a narrative where some people were saying, well, why do we need another book from women about anger? Didn't she write a book about anger? Didn't she write a book about anger? Didn't she write a book about anger? And so when I saw your book about anger joining the conversation, it made me excited, because I thought, oh, white men can write about a lot of things with a lot of takes. And no one ever says, didn't a white guy already write that book about philosophy, right? So I wanted to hear what you think about the conversation you're having with this topic on women and anger and some of the other books that are out.
Well, I think even the title, Still Mad, suggests that anger is still a subject, no matter how many books there have been about it. I mean, and in fact, it goes back to, women's anger goes back to Virginia Woolf, speaking of Virginia Woolf, right? And her articulation of anger in A Room of One's Own, and in even more in Three Guineas. So that's part of it.
Yeah, and I think we're indebted to the writers you mentioned. We cite them and quote them. I think the difference is that ours is focused primarily on literary women from the 1950s to the 2020, whereas they have a different focus.
And
right, and we weren't particularly memoiristic. I mean, even Woolf is more memoiristic than we are. I mean, we didn't talk about personal moments of anger, except for, I think, in the at the end of the acknowledgements, we put in something, right, about Susan being told that to type something by a colleague because he assumed she was a secretary, and me as a graduate student, married to a fellow graduate student, being told that I would have to follow him wherever he went. So we were angry about those things.
And I'm angry that happened to you.
Thank you.
Someone who wanted to get a t-shirt that said "not the intern" for many years, I would say I'm angry with you, because, you know, again, it's sort of those little paper cuts of misogyny that happen. You know,
that's really a wonderful phrase. That's right. That's what they are. Just little paper cuts all over you.
It really is that, you know, the death by 1,000 cuts. I think of it all the time, but that's why I love seeing your book honor the anger and honor the force and the generative force that it is. And I'm excited to bring some questions in. So we have a question from Karen Warren. who is speaking into the literary nature of the book. Women's publishing, journals, presses, newspapers were an important part of women's writers reaching readers in the first wave. But we don't see that same energy around small presses and journals at this point. So I'm wondering how that has affected whose women's work we have access to now.
I think that's absolutely right. Just absolutely right. That's what I would say about that. That is just correct. In other words, that it's very hard. Women's presses were very, very productive in the 70s, and in England and in America. Virago, for example, the feminist press, Daughters, and there were so many different presses, and it did lead to a democratization of voices that I just don't think we have today. I would agree with that author.
I'd like to just add that this reminds me of something I wanted to say when we were talking about consciousness raising, that there's still a need for the kind of consciousness raising that people were doing. But really, I don't know of any spaces where people do that kind of consciousness raising anymore. It's assumed, as it was by my students, that we've come such a long way that we don't need to, except in conversations like this one.
Besides the little presses, there were also little newspapers. There were many brochures. There were pamphlets. I mean,
absolutely.
Our Bodies Ourselves came out at the beginning of the 70s as a pamphlet. There were all kinds of things that were being done by alternative presses, small presses run by women and by collectives. And I don't think we have that anymore.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I have right here, I wish I'd brought it over. I have an original copy of Our Bodies Ourselves. One of the Feminist Press board members, Patricia Wentworth, who I love, who was a Smithy, gave me her copy of Our Bodies Ourselves, one of the early versions of it. And I cherish it very much. There's something about holding that that felt very powerful and transcendent. So, and I wish I could have been there, to see it, even though I was raised, I got a copy of it on my 13th birthday and, was given this, during my rite of passage. But it was nice to see the original when it looked like a zine and you could tell it was made by a collective. And I want to just say, Florence Howe, who is the reason why I'm here today, the founder of the Feminist Press, she told me that she believed that publishing would just understand that we needed more feminist books in 10 years and the feminist press would not need to exist anymore. And now 50 years later, we see that the feminist press is going to need to be existing a really long time. So I just felt the need to bring her in with that question because—
Absolutely. We knew her very well.
Yeah. Somebody just commented in the chat also that there are a few women's bookstores anymore. I remember there used to be, I live in Berkeley, California, where there used to be a lot of those. And I don't know of any.
In Indiana, there was a women's collective bookstore. There was definitely a women's bookstore, and it doesn't exist anymore.
So there are some, and we had very close relationships with them when I was at Feminist Press, and Blue Stockings here in New York is a place that I love to go. But I think, that this goes back to that economic piece that it's Black owned bookstores and women owned bookstores, LGBTQ owned bookstores. Those are the stores that need our support the most for all of the reasons, because they get the least amount of resources and deal with the most marginalization institutionally. And I think that was a really poignant question. And I'm so glad we're talking about it because it's important. So I have one last question, and it's from Cindy Grossman. And Cindy's saying that we've come to the point where the mere mention of a woman's name becomes a punchline and a right-wing joke. They never mention policies that they disagree with, but they use the names, wait for them, I'm sure you could probably guess before I say them, Hillary Clinton, Pelosi, or AOC to rile people up. How has the mere mention of an accomplished woman's name become weaponized in this war on women?
Well, I think that goes back to people like Rush Limbaugh and, of course, Trump, the maestro of all of them. That the contempt and misogynistic anxiety about women shapes their discourse, and so they use women's names as weapons against women. There was when Jill Biden said that she wanted to be known as Dr. Biden. I don't know whether you remember that there was this incredible, well, we talk about it in the book. There was this incredible column written by somebody in the Washington Examiner who said she wasn't really a real doctor.
Washington
No, it
Post.
was not the Washington Post.
Uh-huh.
I don't think the Washington Post would publish that, but maybe I'm wrong. In any case, he said that what kind of a doctor was she? She wasn't a real doctor. Why, she only had a doctorate in education. Moreover, she got her doctorate when she was 56, so that didn't count. And she wasn't serious after all. And she was only teaching in a community college. And it was a whole column devoted to that. It was so outrageous and bizarre. When she is, in fact, as we noted, the first lady to work outside the White House and to have a career of her own.
Oh, it was in the Wall Street Journal. A reader has just informed us.
Oh, really? Well, maybe they picked it up from the Washington Examiner. Never mind. We cite it somewhere.
Yeah, I thought that was such a good question because it's something that really riles me up too. I was thinking about some other names that could be on that list too, but I just Kamala Harris, you tweet a good thing about her and then suddenly a deluge of hate.
Oh, right. You remember Trump was using her. I don't want to repeat what he was mispronouncing her name in a scandalous, racist, misogynistic way. And there was no intellectual substance at all to anything that he was saying. Well, of course, there never was.
I think what we're all talking about is something that is somehow always startling, which is the recalcitrance of misogyny. It's just remarkable. It's resiliency. It's refusal to just go away quietly.
Yeah, that's why I was saying that there are new possibilities, but there are the same old problems.
Yeah.
So, I mean, on the one hand, we can say, as I used to say to my students, look we have come a long way. I couldn't be, 50 years ago, I wouldn't be standing in front of this lecture hall wearing a pantsuit, right? I couldn't have been doing that. But at the same time, they're going to have the kinds of problems managing family and career, responding to misogynistic insults that we've always had.
And I love that though, that you're showing that. That one is one of the things I really took away, that that this is ongoing, but we can do our part now by channeling the righteous anger. And I love to, when we're thinking about the literary history and consciousness raising, about just knowing that, the gaslighting that we've all been experienced, or being told that we're mad or hysterical. They might use different language now, but it's not changed. It's the same root causes, and you so expertly trace that in the book. So I was wondering, and I'm so sad that we're closing because I could have this conversation with you all day. I just wish I could bring this cup of tea I have and offer it to you as we continue to dish about this very important subject. As we head up into the Women's March on October 2nd, and we prepare to rally, with this being also coined as the Rally for Abortion Rights, given the attacks on healthcare that are happening nationwide beyond Texas. This is just one of many places where this is happening, and it's been ongoing. I was curious if you had any words of wisdom for us to take with us about how we can channel our anger, and for those of us who are still mad, how we can carry your wisdom into the streets.
Fight on, march on. It's an ongoing project. It's in a sense that the anger is still alive is a sign of hope. Because if we were completely repressed and suppressed, then we wouldn't be able to articulate the kinds of feelings that we've been talking about now. I'm not sure that 50 years ago, we would have been able to have this conversation. I don't think that in the 50s. So the fact that we can talk about our anger and that you can say, how do we channel the anger, is a step forward in some bizarre way. You see what I mean? Absolutely. Are you disagreeing, Susan? Collaboration.
I agree. And if anything, what our book really demonstrates is that there's a history of wonderfully courageous women of all colors, stripes, and creeds, from every region and every religion and every culinary tradition, and that's there to draw upon.
Right. And to bring forward, to carry forward into the future. I mean, I'm thinking of one of the epigraphs of our book, a line from Yvonne Boland, the Irish poet, who said, "Our past will become the future." No, wait, our future will become the past of other women. Our future will become the past of other women. That's what we're fighting for. We want our future to be the past of other women.
That is so beautiful. I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that in my skin as I see Melanie had this beautiful question of what advice do you have for all the young people as a way forward? And I think that is such an amazing note. And because you know Florence Howe, founder of Feminist Press, I did tell her of a story of someone who left me a voicemail when I started at Feminist Press as the first woman of color and youngest person to run it, that they said, you are what our ancestors dreamt of, that this is now possible for you, is what we always wanted to have happen. And there was a lot of work that led to that moment and a lot of vision, and starting with Florence acquiring the first Black feminist reader in the 70s and the Zora reader with Alice Walker after the Ms. article was published. So thank you also for, paving the way for me and the next generation to do what we do. So I think that's just really important. And I want to say also, I saw someone say the majority of white women, not true. I'm talking about the early acquisitions, that the Black Feminist Reader was one of the earliest acquisitions, but some of us are brave at FP. But obviously over time, the list has become increasingly diverse and gender expansive as well.
Thank you for being you.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful to have you with us. Really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inspiring us to stay mad.
Jamia, thank you so much. Sandra, Susan, thank you. Still Mad, American women writers and the feminist imagination. And if you order from us, you'll get signed book plates and pens that you can wear to the march. Buy them for all the young people in your lives so they know their history and don't have to repeat the lessons and can move forward, right? So grateful for the community we created here tonight with you. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to buy a ton of them for my friends so we can all wear those buttons too.